November 19th, 1988. A maid enters an upstairs bathroom at a country estate in Tortuguitas, 25 miles outside Buenos Aires. She finds Christina Onassis on the floor. The heiress is 37 years old and has been dead for hours. The Argentine federal judge who reviewed the case 2 days later stated she appeared to have died of natural causes, but refused to rule out the effects of drugs. Forensic tests completed in December confirm the presence of optalidon, a barbiturate-containing compound, in her system. A Greek newspaper, VIMA, offered the most unsparing assessment of all: pulmonary edema caused by excessive use of barbiturates, the same way her mother died. The world's press assembled outside the Tortuguitas estate almost immediately, because this woman was worth $250 million in 1988, because her name was the most famous in the history of Greek shipping, because Christina Onassis had been, since her birth in New York City on December 11, 1950, the most written about heiress alive, photographed in St. Moritz and Monaco, on the deck of a yacht named after her, and on a private island in the Ionian Sea that her father had purchased because he could. The obituaries called her glamorous. Many of them were kind. Almost none of them came close to the truth of what had actually ended that morning in Buenos Aires. One of the most emotionally desolate lives of the 20th century, lived inside a fortune that amplified her loneliness at every turn rather than relieving it. She had more money than almost anyone alive. She was one of the most deeply unhappy people who ever lived. And the money and the unhappiness weren't coincidental. They were the same story. To understand what Christina Onassis's childhood looked like, you need to understand what the Onassis world actually was. The yacht Christina O became the defining status symbol of the mid-century jet set. It hosted Winston Churchill, Grace Kelly, Greta Garbo, Richard Nixon, Cary Grant. Aristotle had the bar stools upholstered in whale foreskin, which he reportedly enjoyed announcing to guests after they had already sat down. The yacht carried his daughter's name. She was a fixture of the publicity photographs and a largely absent presence aboard the actual vessel. Scorpios, the private island in the Ionian Sea, was purchased in 1963 because a man who had built the world's largest privately owned shipping fleet from scratch didn't want a place in the world. He wanted his own world. Aristotle dredged the natural harbor specifically to birth the Christina O. He planted olive trees and built villas and installed a full staff. Olympic Tower at 641 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan anchored the New York operations alongside a fleet of more than 50 ships working global trade routes. This was the machine that produced the money. Olympic Airways on top of it. Christina grew up moving between these settings: the island, the yacht, the apartments and estates spread across multiple continents, and was largely invisible in all of them. She attended parties attended by presidents and prime ministers and people whose names appear in history books. She had governesses and nannies and a dedicated staff and everything the world associated with a charmed and fortunate childhood. She understood from a very early age that none of it had been arranged for her. The entire apparatus of Onassis' life was Aristotle's apparatus. She was, at best, a supporting character in it. William Wright, whose 1991 biography, All the Pain Money Can Buy, remains the definitive account of Christina's life, described Aristotle as having wanted his children with him, if only then to ignore them. Rearing Christina and her brother Alexander was delegated to what Wright called an army of nannies and servants. Their mother, Tina Lavanos, daughter of another Greek shipping dynasty, described in the same biography as lovely, delicate, refined, tried to be present when her social schedule permitted. The formulation is illuminating. Not when she could break away, not when she had a free day, when her schedule permitted. Tina Lavanos had married Aristotle Onassis when she was 17 years old. barely past childhood herself. She had grown up inside wealth of a similar scale and had learned what wealthy women in that world were expected to do: attend the right events, wear the right clothes, appear at the right tables in the right company. She wasn't negligent in some deliberate way. She was doing what the world she'd been raised in had equipped her to do. And none of that equipment included sustained, unglamorous, day-to-day mothering. When Christina was approximately 5 years old, she stopped talking. Not gradually, not in certain situations. She simply stopped speaking one day and wouldn't start again. Aristotle and Tina's response was entirely consistent with how the Onassis family handled every problem that money could theoretically solve. They flew the best child psychologists in Zurich to examine their daughter. The Swiss specialists produced a diagnosis, mercurial mutism, they called it, describing it as common in overprotected and insecure children who resort to silence as a means of seeking attention. Wright's interpretation was simpler and more damaging. Christina had stopped talking to force her parents to notice her. Whether that was a strategy or simply what a 5-year-old's distress looks like when it has no other available channel, the response is the part that tells you what you need to know. The checkbook came out. Experts were flown in from Zurich. Nobody, apparently, just stayed home for a week. She found her voice again eventually. The psychologists got the credit. Aristotle and Tina resumed their schedules, and Christina filed away the lesson that would define every significant decision of her adult life. That her value as a person wasn't something anyone around her had simply assumed. It was something she had to perform for, to earn, to demonstrate, or, eventually, to purchase. The Onassis marriage collapsed around 1960, when Christina was 9 or 10. Tina cited Aristotle's affair with opera singer Maria Callas as the proximate cause, an affair conducted with characteristic Onassis subtlety, meaning it had appeared in newspapers across Europe. The divorce was the first of the clean fractures. A father who had rarely been present became a father who was now somewhere else entirely. A mother who had been available when her schedule permitted was now building a separate life on an accelerated timeline. The subsequent sequence of Tina's remarriages is worth tracking carefully because of where it ends. She married the Marquess of Blandford first. Then she married Stavros Niarchos, Aristotle's direct commercial rival, the man he had competed against for decades in Greek shipping, and also the former husband of Tina's own sister, Eugenia Livanos. Eugenia had died in 1970 on the island of Spetsopola from what was officially attributed to a sleeping pill overdose. Her bruised body had been found there. Niarchos was present. The circumstances were never entirely resolved. That specific thread, Niarchos, Tina's sister, sleeping pills, an unexplained death, would echo forward loudly in October 1974. Aristotle, for his part, was managing an empire and preparing his son to inherit it. Alexander was born April 30th, 1948, 2 years before Christina, and was being groomed explicitly and deliberately for succession. He would run the ships. He would take the chair. The future had a specific shape, and Christina's name wasn't on it. What she was supposed to be, beyond existing, beyond appearing at events and representing the Onassis name and eventually making a suitable marriage, was something nobody in her immediate family had worked through, because it had never needed to be. She was the daughter. She grew up knowing this. Her weight began fluctuating seriously through adolescence, documented later in her life at times above 200 pounds, before dropping sharply through crash dieting, then climbing again in cycles that would accelerate and compound over the following 2 decades. The body became the arena for something that had no other available space. She wasn't in therapy. She wasn't having frank conversations with reliably present parents about what she was carrying. She had, instead, the entire social apparatus of the most glamorous milieu in the world at her disposal. and absolutely none of it was designed to address what was actually wrong. By the time she was 17, she was carrying a weight that would have broken most people. Then her father chose Jackie Kennedy. Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy on October 20th, 1968, on the island of Scorpios. Both Alexander and Christina were, by multiple documented accounts, greatly upset by the union. That phrasing is too mild by half. Jackie Kennedy was, at that moment, possibly the most iconic widow in the Western world. The woman who had held her husband's bleeding head in a Dallas motorcade 5 years earlier and emerged from it as a figure of global fascination, elegance, and grief made beautiful. She was everything the Onassis social world valued. Aristotle paid her the kind of attention he had never reliably paid his own children. He installed her in the pink villa on Scorpios, the island where Christina had grown up, and he remade it around her. William Wright described what this meant for Christina with specific precision: a public humiliation and a private torment. Jackie was everything Christina suspected she wasn't and never would be: composed, elegant, internationally celebrated, and now permanently in the space that had been the one constant in a childhood otherwise organized around everyone else's schedules. Christina was 17. She had not been adequately mothered, had barely been fathered, had been watching her weight and her sense of worth fluctuate in parallel for years. And now the world was watching her father lavish on another woman an attentiveness he had never turned on his own family. Her documented view was that Jackie had married for money. She referred to her stepmother publicly, and with a specific bitterness that never softened, as her father's unfortunate obsession. Papers carried stories about conflicts between the two women, though no single dramatic confrontation is documented with specificity in the historical record. The evidence is of a sustained attitude rather than a series of incidents. A teenage girl watching her already emotionally absent father find the ultimate distraction and never come back from it. The financial terms of Jackie's eventual exit are documented. After Aristotle died in 1975, Jackie reportedly received approximately $20 million from Christina in exchange for waiving all further claims to the Onassis estate. Christina had called her a gold digger. Whether or not that characterization was entirely fair, the size of the settlement suggests the accusation wasn't entirely rhetorical. But all of that was aftermath. Before the legal negotiations, before the settlement, before any of that, came the 26 months that took everything. Alexander Onassis was 24 years old on January 22, 1973, when a Piaggio P-136 L-2 amphibious airplane went down at Hellinikon International Airport in Athens. He was aboard as an instructor. A trainee pilot named Donald McCusker was at the controls. An experienced pilot, Donald McGregor, was also present. Approximately 15 seconds after takeoff from runway 33, the right wing dropped and wouldn't come back up. The aircraft lost balance and went down. The crash itself was over in seconds. What followed wasn't. 3 independent investigations reached the same conclusion. An aileron control cable had been installed in reverse during the fitting of a new control column. A maintenance error. The kind of failure that is entirely explicable, entirely preventable, and completely irreversible once it happens at speed. McGregor's alternative theory, that wake turbulence from an Air France Boeing 727 had caused the accident, wasn't supported by any of the 3 investigations. Aristotle Onassis refused to accept the maintenance error conclusion. He offered $1 million for information proving what he believed had actually happened: that someone had murdered his son. He accused the CIA. He accused Greek junta leader Georgios Papadopoulos. He accused Stavros Niarchos. He accused Olympic Airways employees. He accused anyone who could be accused. Not one investigation found any evidence of sabotage. His son had died from a reversed cable on a clear morning at a routine training flight. And no amount of money or accusation or grief could reassemble a different truth from those facts. Alexander Onassis died on January 23, 1973, approximately 27 hours after the crash. He was 24 years old. In his grief over the following weeks, Aristotle said something that, when Christina heard it, functioned as its own separate catastrophe. According to Wright's biography, in his despair, Aristotle had said, "Why wasn't my daughter killed instead of my son?" Wright recorded that when Christina heard this, it didn't do wonders for her always fragile self-esteem. That understatement contains a universe. Her father's first instinct in the worst moment of his life was to wish her dead in her brother's place. She was 22 years old. She had just lost her brother. She had spent her entire childhood learning that Alexander was the one who mattered, that the empire was being built for him, that she was the supplemental child in a plan that had no specific role for daughters. And now she knew exactly, precisely, with no possibility of reinterpretation, how her father ranked her. What Aristotle said next, in the months that followed, confirmed it without intending to. He resigned himself to the fact that Christina would have to control his empire. He had not wanted this. That had not been his plan. The daughter who remained was the wreckage of that plan, and he didn't conceal it especially well. Christina made a suicide attempt after Alexander's death. Her mother Tina helped her recover. It was, by the available record, one of the most present Tina had been as a mother in years. Then, Tina died. October 10, 1974. Tino Lavanos Onassis Niarchos was found dead at the Hotel des Chanelets in Paris. She was 45 years old. Her husband, Stavros Niarchos, was sleeping in the next room, unaware, until he wasn't. The official cause of death was acute pulmonary edema, attributed to a barbiturate overdose. Her body showed no signs of violence. She was unmarked, as one source noted, with a specific clinical flatness that managed to be both reassuring and deeply insufficient. Christina was suspicious immediately. The man sleeping in the next room had been present when Tina's own sister died in a sleeping pill overdose 4 years earlier on Spetsopola. Now Tina, who had just lost her son and who had watched her first husband deteriorate from a neuromuscular disease for the better part of a year, was dead from an overdose of the same substance class in the same household as Niarchos. Christina did the only thing available to her. She requested an autopsy. The New York Times ran the resulting headline without embellishment. Edema found cause in Niarchos' death. The subtext of that headline, that the autopsy had been performed specifically because a daughter had demanded answers, ran underneath it without being stated. She was 23 years old. She had ordered a forensic examination of her mother's body because the alternative was to accept a verdict she couldn't trust from a situation she couldn't leave alone. No evidence of foul play was found. The official cause stood. The suspicion didn't dissolve, and it didn't need to do damage. The grief was doing enough by itself. 21 months after Alexander had died at Helikon Airport, Tino Lavanos was dead in a Paris hotel room. Christina had now lost the only 2 family members who had occasionally been in the room, imperfectly, inconsistently, but present at some level. She was 23 years old, and her father was dying. Aristotle Onassis spent the final year of his life at the American Hospital of Paris in Neuilly-sur-Seine, deteriorating from myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that progressively destroys the muscles controlling speech, swallowing, and breathing. Respiratory failure was the official cause of his death on March 15, 1975. He was 69 years old and had been unraveling for months. Christina spent the last 2 weeks of his life at his bedside. She didn't leave. This detail appears in multiple accounts with consistent specificity. She was there, she stayed, she didn't sleep elsewhere or fly back to Athens to manage the business or take a day for herself. The man who had built an empire intended for her brother, who had, in his grief, wished her dead in Alexander's place, who had brought Jackie Kennedy into the family at 17 without apparent consideration of what that would cost his daughter. She sat with him until his breathing stopped. Whatever was broken between them, she showed up. That's the part that's hard to look at directly. He was buried on Scorpios, on the hillside where he had married Jackie Kennedy 6 years earlier and laid Alexander to rest 2 years before that. The island absorbed the third Onassis burial in less than 3 years. The olive trees stood. The harbor was quiet. Christina was 24 years old and was the only surviving member of her immediate family. William Wright opened All the Pain Money Can Buy with this framing. In the past 23 months, Christina Onassis had lost her mother, her brother, and now her father. Before adjusting to one unexpected death, another struck. The full, verifiable span from Alexander's death on January 23, 1973, to Aristotle's on March 15, 1975, was 26 months. A brother, a mother, a father, one family dismantled in just over 2 years. She had no time to grieve any of them properly, because the moment Aristotle died, she inherited an empire that wasn't going to run itself. What Christina inherited was 55% of the Onassis estate, the remaining 45% going to the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, established in her brother's name. Time magazine, covering the inheritance, described her as heir to her late father Aristotle's $500 million shipping, financial, and industrial empire. The specific asset composition: more than 50 ships, supertankers, bulk carriers, smaller vessels covering global trade routes, alongside Olympic Tower at 641 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the island of Scorpios, and Olympic Airways. She was 24 years old, had just spent 2 weeks watching her father die, and was now expected to operate all of it. Aristotle had not prepared her for this. She was, as Wright put it, spirited, romantic, at times reckless, and totally unprepared for the awesome responsibilities of the shipping empire she had inherited. The Greek shipping industry of 1975 was an overwhelmingly male world with its own hierarchies, codes, and deeply ingrained assumptions about who belonged at the top. A 24-year-old woman in the chairman's chair wasn't something it had ready language for. Her employees, by one contemporary account, weren't too sure about the new boss, who seemed to have a very short fuse. The short fuse is understandable. She was 24 and grieving and running 50 ships. She moved fast. In June 1975, she hired Louis Anderson, former head of Exxon's marine operations, to run Olympic Maritime SA. She renounced her American citizenship that same month, retaining Greek and Argentine citizenships. She donated 8 ships outright to charitable use. Aristotle's longtime general manager, Stelios Papadimitriou, remained a crucial operational anchor. The institutional knowledge of how the empire actually functioned day to day was largely in the hands of people who had been running it for years, and Christina was intelligent enough to use that rather than dismantle it. She proved the doubters wrong. By 1982, she had become one of the few women to serve as president of the Greek Shipowners' Union, a position that, given the culture of that industry, required fighting for in ways that had nothing to do with shipping logistics. She gradually, by the account of multiple sources, strengthened her hold over the Onassis Group. She kept the ships moving and the operation solvent through a period of significant global shipping volatility. The specific irony embedded in this achievement is considerable. The daughter her father had never prepared to run his empire ran it. The son he had groomed for the position was dead at 24. She was doing it without the decades of preparation Aristotle had poured into Alexander, while simultaneously processing catastrophic grief and conducting the desperate search for love that would define the remaining 13 years of her life. By the time of her death in 1988, the greater part of the fleet had been sold off and not replaced. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation assumed management. The business decisions tracked the psychological ones. She had married for the first time in 1971, before the deaths, before the inheritance, when she was 20 years old and her life still had the shape it was supposed to have. Joseph Bolker was 47 when Christina married him on July 26, 1971. He was a divorced Los Angeles real estate developer with 4 daughters. They had met in Monte Carlo. The age gap was 27 years. What a 20-year-old girl who had been raised by nannies and largely ignored by an emotionally absent father saw in a 47-year-old man with 4 daughters requires no elaborate analysis. Aristotle's response to the marriage was immediate and total. He told his daughter she was dead to him as long as she remained married to Bolker. He applied financial pressure and made clear through intermediaries that the marriage was unacceptable. 9 months after the wedding, Christina chose her father over her husband. The marriage ended in early 1972. The logic of that choice, looked at clearly, is devastating. She surrendered the man she had chosen, however complicated the psychology of that choice, to preserve the approval of a man who had publicly announced she was dead to him. She was 21 and already operating according to a logic that would govern all 4 of her marriages. The love of the person most likely to reject her was the only love that mattered. 3 months after Aristotle's death, the grave on Scorpios barely settled. Christina married Alexander Andreadis on July 22, 1975. He was 30, a Greek banking and shipping heir whom Time magazine had described in its coverage as part of a speedy romance. Multiple biographers characterized him as a notorious playboy. The marriage lasted approximately 14 months. Biographers described it as little more than a facade. Christina reportedly paid him off to exit the arrangement quietly. She was 24 and had been married and divorced twice in 4 years, and every person who had ever known her family was starting to use the word curse. The third marriage broke every convention the first 2 had operated within. In August 1978, she married Sergei Kauzov, a Soviet shipping official she had encountered during negotiations in Moscow. The New York Times headline on August 2, 1978, was direct in its bewilderment. Capitalist bride in Moscow, Christina Onassis. She traded a Parisian penthouse for a state-owned Moscow apartment to be near him. The Western reaction ranged from baffled to alarmed. Financial advisors warned. The Greek shipping world reacted with something approaching horror. She went ahead anyway. The appeal of Kauzov exists on several levels, none of which required the KGB explanation that one American newspaper breathlessly printed in 1980 without official corroboration. She had spent her life inside a world defined entirely by wealth and status, and the suffocating scrutiny of people who knew her name and her net worth before they knew anything else about her. A Soviet shipping bureaucrat was, by definition, outside all of that. A person who had not grown up reading about the Onassis yacht, who didn't spend dinner calculating her inheritance. Whether or not that explains the full emotional geometry of it, the pattern is consistent with a woman trying to find a space where the money stopped preceding her through every door. The marriage lasted approximately 2 years. Culture shock, political pressure, and what Christina herself described as fundamental incompatibility brought it to its end. She returned to Western Europe, describing herself as more isolated and heartbroken than ever. She was 29, divorced for the 3rd time, and still looking for the same thing she had been looking for since she was 5 years old, and had gone silent to make someone notice she was in the room. Then she met Thierry Roussel. She married him on March 17, 1984, in a civil ceremony at Paris City Hall that morning and a Greek Orthodox ceremony that afternoon. He was 31, born February 16, 1953, a French pharmaceutical heir. By every biographical account available, Roussel was the one she genuinely loved. Not the rebellion of a Bolker, not the survival reflex of an Andreatis, not the contrarianism of a Kauzov. She wanted him. Specific. A friend told her, before the ceremony, what anyone close to the situation already knew: that Thierry had a girlfriend named Gabby, Marianne Landhage, a Swedish model, and that he would never leave her. The friend said this directly. Christina heard it, processed it, and walked into the church anyway. She had known about Gabby Landhage before the wedding. This is documented and not in dispute. She married Thierry Roussel in full knowledge of the ongoing relationship because the alternative was to not have Thierry Roussel, and she apparently found that alternative unacceptable. This isn't the decision of a naive woman. It's the decision of someone who has concluded that partial love from the person you've chosen is preferable to no love at all, a calculation she had been making, in different forms, since childhood. Their daughter, Athena Hélène Roussel, was born on January 29, 1985. She was, throughout the biographical record, the most uncomplicated love of Christina's adult life. The one relationship that functioned without transaction, without negotiation, without the specific anxiety of wondering if the other person was really there for her. Athena was simply hers in a way nothing else ever had been. People who knew Christina in the last years of her life consistently described the difference in her when she spoke about her daughter. But while Christina was pregnant with Athena, Gabby Landhage was also pregnant by Roussel. He had maintained his relationship with Landhage without interruption through the marriage. Landhage gave birth to a son just months after Athena arrived. Two women carrying this man's children simultaneously, one of them his wife. When the full picture became unavoidable, the parallel family, the concurrent pregnancies, the son born alongside his daughter by a woman her husband loved more. Christina's response was documented in multiple biographical sources. She made a desperate attempt to hold on to him by offering to adopt Landhage's child. She would take in the baby of the woman her husband preferred, if that was what keeping him required. It wasn't what keeping him required. He wasn't keeping himself to be kept. The marriage ended around 1987. Thierry Roussel married Gabby Landhage in 1990, 2 years after Christina's death. In November 1988, he stood at Christina's funeral on Scorpios and read her eulogy. He delivered it, by accounts, composed. 4 marriages, 4 divorces. Bolker was the paternal proxy. Older, stable, a substitute for the father who had never been reliably there. Andreatis was the survival reflex of a 24-year-old with no family left, grabbing for something solid in the rubble of a dynasty that had just collapsed entirely. Kauzov was defiance as much as desire, a step outside the entire social architecture that had defined and constrained her life. And Roussel was love, the real kind, or the closest thing to it she ever found, pursued by a woman who had been told, in word and in action, and in Aristotle's devastating grief-drunk question, that she wasn't worth choosing as a first priority by anyone. Each failed her, or she failed them, or the specific hole she was trying to fill was too large and too particular for any one person to address. The pattern was one thing, and the specific details of each marriage were another, and both were produced by the same originating wound. The Guardian, writing about Christina's life in 2003, described her as someone who had fought eating disorders, drug abuse, and depression most of her adult life. Time magazine was more clinical. She struggled with an eating disorder and an addiction to diet pills until her death from heart failure. The specific substances were barbiturates for anxiety management and amphetamines for weight control. The specific pattern was extreme dietary restriction producing rapid, dramatic weight loss, followed by the weight returning within months, followed by more extreme restriction and higher doses, cycling and compounding over 2 decades. Her weight fluctuated throughout her adult life, documented at times above 200 pounds, before dropping sharply and climbing again. The obsession with the body wasn't primarily about vanity, though it got reported that way endlessly. The body was the one arena where she had direct, legible control in a life where control had been stripped away repeatedly. Parents who left, a brother who died, a father who wished she had died instead. 4 husbands who chose other things over her. She couldn't make any of that different. She could control whether she ate. And she could, with the right prescription, manage how much the rest of it hurt. Her wealth made the addiction sustainable at the scale it reached, and that is the specific cruelty of it. Private physicians in the world she inhabited don't function like retail pharmacies with oversight systems and insurance flags. Private prescriptions don't get cross-checked against multiple providers. The money that was theoretically available to provide the world's best psychiatric care instead provided the world's most accommodating prescribers, because when no means finding a different doctor who will say yes, and money is the only leverage anyone needs to find that different doctor, meaningful medical intervention becomes practically optional. Nobody could make it stop. Her wealth was leverage against anyone who tried. The physical toll was accumulating in concrete, measurable ways. Years of severe cyclical dieting placed documented strain on cardiac function. Sustained barbiturate use depresses the central nervous system and puts consistent pressure on cardiac muscle over time. The two together are specifically dangerous in combination. The trajectory looked at clearly was one direction. By the mid-1980s, the loneliness had become its own economy. Luis Basualdo was a friend, or the nearest approximation the situation permitted. Christina paid him $30,000 a month, $360,000 a year, to clear his schedule, accompany her wherever she went, manage her social life, and ensure she wasn't alone. An Anson record column documented the arrangement with specific language. Christina begged Basualdo not to leave, offering him $30,000 a month to stay and be her friend. He accepted. His girlfriend was included in the arrangement as part of the package. Documented payments from the same period include $4 million in loans to the Dodero family and $50,000 to a man named Nicky Mavrolian. The $30,000 a month figure is the one that crystallizes everything about her life into a single image. Not the yacht, not the 50 ships or the tower on Fifth Avenue or the private island in the Ionian Sea. This. One of the wealthiest women in the world, writing a check every month to make sure someone would spend time with her. On Scorpios, in the evenings, she would assemble people on the deck of the Christina O or at the villa and create the approximation of a gathering. The staff impeccable, the food prepared, the harbor quiet below, the island lit and maintained and entirely beautiful. She brought people to the island with whatever resources were required to get them there and keep them there. And she would sit in the middle of all of it, surrounded by people at least some of whom had financial arrangements with her for their presence, and try to replicate the feeling of family. It produced warmth, temporarily. It produced the correct shape of what a social life should look like. It didn't produce the specific thing she was actually looking for, which was the uncomplicated certainty that the person across the table had chosen to be there. The $30,000 was what the end of that sentence looked like in practice. A 5-year-old who had gone silent to make her parents notice her had grown up into a woman who paid $30,000 a month for the same result. The currency had changed, the need was identical. Nigel Dempster, whose biography of Christina remains one of the primary sources on her life, described her as having survived a childhood of pampered neglect, a phrase that holds the central contradiction without forcing it into resolution. Pampered and neglected, both fully real, both fully present, coexisting in the same house, the same yacht, the same island. Everything provided for, nothing given. William Wright framed her life as an individual drama, with its dizzying swings between grief and joy, weakness and strength. The more exact framing is that a child who was never simply told she was worth staying for spent 37 years and a significant portion of $1 billion trying to prove otherwise. She had been in Buenos Aires regularly in the final years of her life. Her Argentine citizenship made it a second home of a different texture than Scorpio's, less freighted with the accumulated grief of 3 graves and a father's legacy, more genuinely social in the way that cities are social. The Dodero family's circle gave her a network there that felt, by her later accounts, relatively uncomplicated. In November 1988, she was staying at the Tortuguitas estate of Jorge Chomlekjoglu, a 42-year-old textile businessman connected to the Dodero family, 25 miles outside Buenos Aires in the Argentine countryside. The estate was large and well-staffed. The weeks before her death were, by the accounts of people who had seen her, not uniformly dark. Her daughter Athena, 3 years old, was the subject she spoke about with the most evident warmth. Whatever else had become transaction, Athena was something real. She talked about her constantly.
But the body's accounting does not negotiate with warmth.
Years of cyclical crash dieting, sustained barbiturate use, and the cardiac strain that both produce in sustained combination had been accumulating damage at a pace no amount of money or willpower could reverse. The heart registers what has been done to it, regardless of the circumstances in which the doing occurred. On November 19, 1988, a maid found Christina Onassis in the bathroom of the Tortuguitas estate. She was dead at 37 years old. The Argentine federal judge who reviewed the case stated she appeared to have died of natural causes, but refused to rule out drug involvement. December forensic tests confirmed optalidon in her system. To VIMA, writing in Greek for a Greek audience that understood exactly what the comparison meant, called it plainly, pulmonary edema caused by excessive barbiturate use. The same cause, the same organ, the same drugs as her mother. Tina Lavanos had died at 45 in a Paris hotel room in October 1974. Christina Onassis died at 37 in a Buenos Aires estate in November 1988. Same death certificate, different city, 14 years apart. 2 VIMA saw the line between them and said it out loud. On November 27, 1988, she was buried on Scorpios, laid beside Aristotle and Alexander, her father and her brother, the 2 people whose love she had spent her entire life trying to earn and couldn't buy and couldn't keep and lost before she was 25. Thierry Roussel, her 4th ex-husband, stood at the grave and read the eulogy. The island was cold in late November. The harbor where the Christina O had once berthed was quiet. The olive trees Aristotle had planted were still there. Finally, all of them were together again in the one place that had always been theirs. Athena Hélène Roussel was 3 years old when her mother died. She became, immediately and by law, the sole heir to the Onassis fortune. The estate was placed in trust until her 18th birthday. Thierry Roussel was named her guardian. He married Gabby Landhague in 1990, and Athena went to live with them in Switzerland, raised by the father who had broken her mother's heart, in a household that included the half-sibling, whose existence had been one of the final proofs of that breakage. Legal battles over the administration of Athena's estate between Roussel and the Onassis Foundation ran through European courts for years. On January 29, 2003, her 18th birthday, Athena Onassis Roussel gained control of an inheritance estimated at approximately $2.7 billion. She grew up in Switzerland, far from Scorpios, far from Greek shipping culture, far from the particular fever dream of Onassis' social life that had consumed her mother. Whether that distance was a protection or a deprivation depends on what you conclude the Onassis world had done to the people who lived inside it. The historical record on that question isn't ambiguous. The fortune passed on with perfect legal precision, every percentage point accounted for, every trust instrument executed on schedule, every legal challenge eventually resolved. The accounting was flawless. Christina Onassis had more money than almost anyone alive, and she was one of the most deeply unhappy people of the 20th century. The $1 billion didn't cause the unhappiness. What caused it was a 5-year-old girl who went silent to make her parents notice her. And parents who sent her to Zurich rather than sitting down. What the money did was pay for everything that followed. Every crash diet, every barbiturate prescription, every month of Luis Basualdo's salary, every marriage entered in the specific kind of desperation that no amount of wealth resolves. Because wealth is the wrong tool for the problem. She died at 37 in a friend's bathroom, far from home, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter and a fortune intact. The money survived her perfectly. It always does. Subscribe for more stories like this.